So, you're interested in trying out Path of Exile 2, but the game seems big and really overwhelming. Believe me, I understand. I've spent the last few days grinding the hell out of PoE just to give you today's video. We are going to go over everything I can think of to help new players understand how the game works a little bit better, and we're going to go over all the following topics. By the way, today's video is also brought to you by Path of Exile 2, which actually works out really well for me because I've been looking forward to making this guide either way. The game's out right now in early access. Check it out with your buddies. I recommend it highly, but obviously watch this guide first so you know what you're doing. Grab an early access key down in the pinned comment and check out the full free-to-play version of the game in 2025. Thank you, Path of Exile 2, for sponsoring this guide. All right, let's go. First up, the playable classes. There are technically 12 playable classes in Path of Exile 2, but we only have access to 6 of them right now in early access. Those options are Warrior, Monk, Ranger, Sorceress, Witch, and Mercenary. When the full release of the game eventually comes out in 2025, we'll also have access to Druid, Marauder, Huntress, Duelist, Templar, and Shadow. We don't have a ton of info on the full release classes right now, so why don't we stick to what we know and give a very general baseline idea of the power fantasy behind each of these classes. Warrior. This is your typical strength-based melee class. A big and bulky dude who lives on the front line who is able to take damage and also dish it back. They have war cries, which can buff allies, they can do ground pound AoE type stuff, and they have hard-hitting melee weapons. Warriors can use two-handed weapons if they wish, or they can also wield shields in combat, which you can actively block with if you choose to do so. Monk is a more agile and dexterous melee fighter. They have movement tech, which allows them to zigzag across the battlefield very quickly, and usually wield things like a quarterstaff, which they can also use to dish out elemental attacks, and fun stuff like a giant bell, which you can use to stun enemies, stuff like that. Ranger is your classic bow-using projectile class. You can backpedal and strafe around, creating distance between you and your enemies while you pelt them with a wide variety of ranged arrow attacks. You also have fun stuff like AoE poison attacks or even harder-hitting single-target arrow attacks. You even have some nature-based stuff that lets you tangle up enemies in vines. You get the idea. Sorceress is an elemental damage-based magic class. You've got a combination of both projectile attacks, throwing either fire, lightning, or ice at the enemy, and also summoning elemental obstacles on the battlefield to do quality AoE damage, like walls of fire, walls of ice, and other fun stuff like that. Witch is also a magic caster, but more of a summoning class. They raise armies of undead minions who follow you around and do your bidding while you sit in the backfield putting curses and whatnot on enemies. Mercenary is kinda like Ranger. You use ranged attacks, but instead of a bow, you have a crossbow, which basically functions like a medieval gun. The difference really being that there's no real travel time on any of your shots. They connect immediately. You have different types of ammo and different types of ranged attacks. You got shotgun-like burst fire, freezing ranged attacks, and you can even throw grenades that can damage or stun enemies. Basically a medieval version of the Punisher, and that really isn't a joke. Quick note, there's something we'll get into a little bit later. You may hear it referred to as Ascension or Ascendancy. That's a term you're going to hear a lot in Path 2. The best way I can describe this to a completely new player is basically a subclass, or better yet, a specialization for your class. Again, more on that later. Next up, a basic idea of how combat works, including talking about your HUD. Here we are, out in the wild. A lot of the areas you're going to visit are usually going to be really large. So with that in mind, you'll probably be doing a lot of map exploring. The more you go around any given area, the more your map will reveal as you uncover new areas. Enemies will show up very frequently in groups, and you'll use your skills, aka unique attacks based on your class, to deal damage and kill them. We'll cover skills shortly, but it's basically just aim the attack with your mouse, click the corresponding skill button on your HUD in the bottom right, and boom, you do it. Some skills are very spammable, while others, usually ones that are harder hitting or just better overall, will likely come with a cooldown or may cost more resources to activate. For example, I'm playing Sorceress. My attacks use mana, that is the resource down here in the bottom right indicated by the blue orb. My most powerful attacks eat up a lot of mana, so you gotta do a little bit of resource management in combat, depending on what class you play. If you wind up taking too much damage, you'll have to heal. That is where flasks come into play. If you're an old school Diablo player, you might remember that you have potions, which are kind of a one and done drink type deal. Flasks are kinda similar, but rather than having a ton of them, you just have this one big flask that when activated will recover a certain amount of health over a short period of time. The amount of health you have remaining is indicated by this giant red orb in the bottom left corner. Because you can only carry the one flask, flasks have charges, you see. For example, my current flask has 75 total charges, but me activating the flask to heal will only consume 10. So you get multiple uses out of each flask. You can refill those charges by either killing monsters in combat, which you'll be doing a lot, or you can refill them at a well. Each act in the game has a hometown type area where you can find a well. Go up to it and drink, and bam, your charges in your flask will be refilled. I also have a mana flask. Again, I'm playing a sorceress. My magic attacks cost mana, and the mana flask operates the exact same way. If you're wondering what this little light blue bar is just outside of my health meter, that would be my energy shield. If you take damage in combat, your energy shield takes the initial damage, and when your energy shield is completely depleted, then your health meter begins to take damage. Your energy shield will naturally recharge over time, which is nice, and you'll have ways to boost the strength of your energy shield either via the passive skill tree, which we'll get to, or via your gear, which can sometimes have shield boosting perks. In a similar way, you have something called Spirit, which is represented by this thin looking meter over here on the right outside of your mana bar. Spirit is a different kind of resource that you can use for certain passive skills. I have a particular skill I can activate right now, Frost Armor, which runs entirely on Spirit as opposed to mana. Two final things regarding combat. If you have a shield, you can actively block incoming attacks, which is more important for shield wielders like the warrior and less important for spellcasting folks like my sorceress. And the other thing that every class can appreciate though is the ability to dodge. In combat, if you just tap the spacebar, you can dodge in any direction you choose. This can be really helpful in boss fights because a lot of boss attacks in Path 2 are A, highly telegraphed, and B, attacks you really want to not get hit by. Many attacks do hella damage or can flat out one-shot you. It's kind of like a Diablo meets Elden Ring type thing, if that makes sense. All right, why don't we cover the passive skill tree real quick. Believe me, I know this is going to look wildly intimidating, but bear with me, I promise it will make sense. As you level up in Path of Exile 2, you will unlock passive skill points which you can spend on this tree. Each choice will give a passive buff to your character in one way or another. For example, plus 10% increased spell damage. Yay! Now, if you're looking at this passive skill tree and thinking, holy lord, there are hundreds of choices here. This is like looking up at the goddamn night sky. I'm gonna have a stroke. I mean, yeah, but remember, this is a passive skill tree for literally every combined class in the game. Every class just has a different starting point on the tree. For example, I'm starting up at the top, which is the default sorceress path, but monk players will have this exact same tree, but they'll start over here off to the right. Also, there's no real rules as to where you can or can't branch off to. Currently, I'm branching straight up because I'm a boring stay in my lane sorceress for the time being. But eventually, who knows? Maybe I want to branch off in this direction for whatever reason. Maybe it makes sense with a wild and crazy build I've come up with. It's really up to you. By the way, you might notice that some of the circles on the passive skill tree are larger than others. The larger options are referred to as notables. In short, they offer better and stronger buffs, so it's usually a good idea to try and build towards those whenever you can. If at any point you think to yourself, these perks suck, I don't like my build anymore, well, that's fine, you can change them. Early on in Act 1, you should meet a character named the Hooded One, who you'll eventually bring back to the nearby hometown, and for a small fee, aka gold, you can respec your passive skill tree one perk at a time. I'm doing a little respecking here right now. I was specced into Energy Shield for a boss fight who was really hard, but I finally beat his stupid ass, and now I'm going to respec these points into something more offense-focused. My sorceress does a lot of cold damage, so these passives that penetrate cold resistance are perfect for me. I'm going to take those instead. Moving on, why don't we talk about something I was very confused by originally, so I'm sure the average brand new player might be as well. We are now going to talk about skills and gems and everything related to gems. In short, gems are how you unlock and customize skills. Again, very confusing to me as a former Diablo player, but I will explain. You see, in many other games, you learn skills or spells or whatever by directly leveling up. Random example, Pikachu hits level 36, Pikachu learns Thunderbolt easy enough to understand. This is not how things work in Path 2. Sometimes in combat, defeated enemies will drop these skill gems. If it is a fresh drop from an enemy, it'll technically say uncut skill gem, but for now, think of them as skill gems. You pick up that gem and you put it in your inventory, and whenever you feel like using it, you right-click it, and we open up the gem cutting page. This is both how you learn brand new skills and upgrade skills you already know. For example, here I have a level 9 skill gem in my inventory. Yes, gems have levels, but don't panic. Early on in the game, you'll start off by finding level 1 skill gems. Then as things get harder and you get further and deeper, you'll have the ability to find skill gems of higher levels. This one is a level 9 skill gem, so when I right-click and open up the gem cutting page, here are my options. Now I can choose to do either one of two things. I can either A, unlock a brand new skill that I can only unlock with a level 9 skill gem. See that Roman numeral 9 over there? That means, for example, I could not unlock the Fireball skill if I only had a level 1 skill gem. Fireball can only be learned by a level 9 skill gem. But my other choice is B. I can upgrade an old skill that I already know up to level 9 power. I really do want to upgrade my Cold Snap skill to level 9 because I like it a lot, but I want to be thorough for the guide, so I'll unlock a totally new skill. Mana Tempest sounds kind of badass, so I'll choose that. And don't worry, I can upgrade Cold Snap later. There's always more skill gems to be found. All right, now I have cut my gem, and my skill gem is no longer an uncut skill gem, but now it's a Mana Tempest spell just sitting in my inventory. If I want to be able to actually use it, I should add it to my overall list of skills, which I do by hitting G on my keyboard. This is my total list of active skills I'm able to use in combat. I currently have 11 skills at my disposal, indicated by those big gems in the far left column. Technically, 9 of them are from skill gems and 2 of them up at the top, which have different symbols over in the far left. Those are skills that I can use because I have gear that allows me to use them. For example, freezing shards, which again has that unique weapon icon under it. If I open my inventory and hover over my currently equipped staff, yeah, it's granting me the ability to cast that spell. Same thing with my other staff for the Sigil of Power spell. Anyway, back to my skill list. I want to use our new Mana Tempest skill, but again, I don't currently have room. For the time being, I will unequip Orb of Storms and move it back into my inventory. You'll notice that there are 2 other smaller gems next to Orb of Storms. They also detach into my inventory when I de-equip the skill. We'll talk about those other 2 smaller gems in a minute, don't worry. All right, now we have enough room to equip Mana Tempest, meaning we're able to cast it in battle. Final step is I now have to assign it to a certain key. You'll see your available options down there in the bottom right of your HUD. Currently, I'm kind of full up here, but here's a nice trick for you. If you hold down Control, look at that. Now you have even more options available to you. I'm going to assign this to Control Q. Now in battle, when I hit Control and Q, I cast Mana Tempest, GG. Because skills are something you can equip and de-equip at will, you can stash skills you're not currently using in your inventory, or better yet, in your stash. A chest at your hometown that only you have access to. See, I've got a bunch here in my very unorganized stash that I'm holding on to. If I want to mix up my build later, I can come back and use any of these whenever I want. All right, why don't we rewind a minute? Remember before I pulled out Orb of Storms, there were 2 other smaller gems sitting right beside it in the row, and there are a few other skills here that have other smaller orbs next to them. Those smaller gems are support gems, another kind of gems that will occasionally drop in battle as loot from a dead enemy. I want you to think of support gems as customization gems. That is to say, a way of changing a spell or skill to behave differently, if you want it to. Here's an example. I have a skill here called Frostbolt. Normally, with no support gems inserted at all, the spell will look like this. I cast one single Frostbolt forward in one direction whenever I cast the spell. However, I want to customize it, so I add a support gem to it. This one is called Scattershot, and as the text reads, any skill I insert it into will fire 2 additional projectiles. I insert the Scattershot support gem into the skill, and now look at it. Whenever I cast it, 3 Frostbolts now will come out instead of just 1. To repeat, support gems equals customize your skills. Be sure to read all the text in a support gem though, because there are often drawbacks. For example, Scattershot also has a slower cast speed, and it now deals less damage. Again, the benefit though is that I now have 3 attacks for the price of 1. one. It's kind of a give and take type deal. Why don't we use a brand new support gem? I have one here in my inventory. I right click it open, and now the game basically wants to know which of my active skills I would like to customize. You've got options, so take your time and look around. Frost Wall apparently has an option called Deep Freeze. If I freeze anyone using Frost Wall, they'll have a 50% longer freeze duration. Yeah, that sounds really awesome. I'm gonna go ahead and take that. I cut and engrave that support gem and insert it into my skills right next to Frost Wall, and we're done. Remember, some of these support gems are mix and match. For example, I have this concentrated effect support gem that I currently have inserted into my Flame Wall spell. But if I want, I can take it out and put it into Solar Orbs instead. You have a ton of options to customize your skills exactly how you want. Support gems aren't universal though. Some just can't be inserted into any skill, but again, many of them can. Fiddle and play around with them until you find something that works for you. You also have spirit gems, which work in the same way. Here's one I pulled off a dead guy. I right click it and this shows me what the game calls persistent buff skills. I may decide to use this to unlock mana remnants later. And by the way, you might notice that even though I'm a sorceress, I can click over to the witch tab and I can use this to get a persistent witch buff if I wanted to. Some classes overlap with this kind of stuff, and even though none of the witch stuff currently interests me, maybe it will later on. Eventually, I might come up with a wild build that borrows random witch stuff. I don't know, get weird with it if you want. All right, moving on. Something I probably should have covered in the passive skill tree section, but in case people want to search for it directly, I'll give it its own little chapter right here. We're talking about attributes. On the passive skill tree, which you all know about by now, you'll notice that some options look like this. +5 to intelligence. What does that mean? Well, there are 3 core attributes in Path of Exile 2: strength, dexterity, and intelligence. Strength is a key attribute for equipping certain melee weapons. You literally won't be able to wield certain weapons or armor you might find in the field if your strength is too low. My sorceress doesn't care about not being able to wield a giant two-handed weapon, but your warrior definitely might. It's also directly tied to your character's life, aka the more strength you have, the more life you have. Again, extremely important for beefy frontline fighters like the warrior. Dexterity is important for ranged weapon accuracy. Each point of dexterity you have boosts your accuracy rating, aka a measure of how likely you are to hit things with a ranged weapon attack. Higher dexterity also means higher evasion in combat. If you don't know what evasion is, no, it isn't the in-game dodge mechanic I showed you earlier by hitting spacebar. Evasion, basically, is a chance that any incoming attack will literally just not hit you and deal 0 damage. As you can imagine, the monk and the ranger both really appreciate dexterity because they're not as bulky as the warrior and enjoy not getting hit. The ranger also appreciates dexterity for ranged weapon accuracy in general, of course. Intelligence is tied to mana and spell casting. Basically, each point of intelligence will raise your mana by 2. The sorceress and the witch both really appreciate this because them ladies be spellcasting 24/7. Like other gear in the game, certain gear can only be worn if you have a high enough intelligence. My current chest armor requires a 34 intelligence to equip, which thankfully my sorceress has. I really need that because my armor regenerates my life and gives me a better energy shield, which again, I need because I'm a frail, thin, back of the map sorceress. Alright, on the subject of your gear, why don't we talk about your inventory? Clicking I brings up your inventory, and why don't we take a look around? Up top, this is all the gear you have equipped. You can have 2 weapons, more on that in a minute, a headpiece, a chest piece, gloves, a belt, shoes, 2 rings, 1 amulet, your healing and mana flask, which we've already gone over, and charms. I only have the ability to hold 1 charm right now, but I'll get access to more later. Charms just give you extra effects. Currently, I have one that gives me better lightning resist, yay. Regarding your 2 weapons, they can actually be switched pretty fluidly in combat. For example, I have 2 staffs right now. The staff in weapon slot number 1 lets me cast freezing shards, and the staff in weapon slot number 2 lets me cast Sigil of Power. If I'm in combat and I want to cast Sigil of Power, my sorceress automatically swaps to that staff in order to use the attack. If I want to cast Freezing Shards, again, she'll just whip out the appropriate staff when I hit the attack button. Also, another helpful tip to know. If you open up your passive skill tree and look in the top right, you can allocate certain points on your passive skill tree for either of the 2 weapons that you're holding. Remember that for me, weapon slot number 1 is a staff that uses an ice attack. Well, I can allocate certain passive skills to only get turned on if I'm wielding the corresponding weapon. So in theory, if I were to click weapon set 1 up here in the top right and allocate this unused skill point, this passive skill will be active but only when I have weapon slot number 1 equipped in my hand. That lets you customize your passive skill tree more depending on your active loadout, which is pretty cool. On the subject of your gear, why don't we talk about runes real quick? Runes are a type of loot that can fall from dead enemies, and you can socket them into certain pieces of gear, provided that piece of gear comes with an empty socket. See right here, I have a shield in my stash that I'm holding onto for some reason. Maybe I'll give it to a friend later. But if you hover over it, that hole in the center of the shield, that means it has a socket. And if I want, I can put a rune into it. When put into socketed armor, runes will give that armor better resistance, aka things like fire resist, lightning resist, or cold resist. Putting runes into a weapon will let you apply that type of damage when you attack. So for example, dealing cold damage with a sword after you've put a cold rune into it. I've also learned that for whatever reason, you can't put a rune into that piece of gear if you have it equipped on your character. You have to de-equip it first, then put the rune into it, then you can re-equip the gear. I don't know why it's like that. It's kind of weird, but whatever. I promise we're nearing the end, but why don't we talk about orbs and shards? These are also items you can get off dead enemies, and they do really fun things. Here's an interesting one. Orb of Alchemy upgrades a normal item into a rare item with 4 modifiers. Can't believe I'm going to use this item for a guide video, but as Grandpa used to say, fuck it, we ball. I right-click my Orb of Alchemy and it shows me which of my gear are normal items that I can use this orb on. You can see that the available gear I have to use it on becomes highlighted. By the way, normal items just mean that the name of the item is written in regular gray text. And side note, there are 4 tiers of items: normal, magic, rare, and unique. But anyway, I use my Orb of Alchemy and apply it to this normal ring, and bam, I've now upgraded it into a rare ring. It's actually kind of sick. I think I may wear that, GG. There are many orbs like this that you will find in the game that you can use to modify or customize your gear. Some people may tell you to hoard them and use them only in ultra rare situations, and yeah, I guess you could do that, but really just do whatever you want. Don't let other people tell you how to live your life. Shards are just what orbs are made of, by the way. For example, look here, I have 6 regal shards. When I ultimately get 10, I can take all of them and turn them into 1 regal orb and use that the same way I used my Orb of Alchemy. All right, now why don't we talk about Ascendancy? See, I told you we'd get to it eventually. As I mentioned earlier, an Ascendancy is sort of like picking a specialization for your class. Here's a dumb example to help you understand better. Let's say you're a pastry chef, and after chefing for a while, you decide you want to pick an Ascendancy. The 2 options presented to you are Cake Ascendancy or Pie Ascendancy. At the end of the day, you're still a pastry chef either way and can make whatever you want. But now at the very least, you have the option to lean into a specialty a little bit more if it appeals to you and all the benefits that come with it. Maybe if you take the Cake Ascendancy, you bake cakes 10% faster in your oven, and they require 10% less ingredients for you to create. As mentioned, I have a sorceress, and when the time came for me, I had the option of picking either Chronomancer or Stormweaver. Chronomancer was basically you get access to magic that can manipulate time, like freeze time, which honestly does sound really great. I decided to go with Stormweaver though, because I want to be a master of the elements and spice up my cold attacks, which are currently my favorite. In order to hit your first Ascendancy, you eventually need to defeat a hidden boss somewhere in Act 2. Doing that will lead you down a side quest where you'll wind up doing an activity called the Trial of the Sechemas, a very tricky side quest where you're going to have to basically run a gauntlet of challenges back to back, all while trying to get hit as little as possible. I recommend waiting until you're around your mid-20s level-wise to attempt that challenge. I think I first tried it around level 22, found it to be quite hard, left it, then came back at around level 30 or so and just breezed through it immediately. When you complete the trial, you'll be able to unlock your first Ascendancy, and the next time you open up your passive skill tree, it'll be right there in the dead center of the tree with additional options for you to take. Leveling up your Ascendancy tree requires Ascendancy points, which are different than regular skill tree points. Even though many things in Path 2 are extremely customizable, like support gems, Ascendancies are apparently carved in stone. So make sure you give your Ascendancy a decent amount of thought before committing to one, because once you do, you cannot undo it. Marry that sucker and do it hard till death do you part. Or until you make a new character, I guess. Literally, the last thing I can think of for now, which I couldn't really think of where else to put this, how to go to town. If you're out in combat and there's no waypoint nearby and you want to go home, no problem. Just go down here in the bottom right of your screen and click Create a Portal to Town, And there you go back to town. If today's video helped you out in any way as a new player, do me a favor and click the like button so other new players can find the video a bit more easily. If you're a veteran player who's watching this for some reason and you feel like there's extra information that new players might appreciate, be sure to drop it down in the comment section. Thank you very much for watching. Peace!